To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. These lines are from William Blake's poem Auguries of Innocence, and they give a glimpse of the sort of seeing that he himself tried to practice in his own life and expressed in his art. And I think a good way to exemplify this idea that a certain way of seeing can open the micro into the macro, a grain of sand into a world, or the temporal into the eternal. A good way to exemplify this in modern terms is to think of the famous 1977 film by the Eames, Charles and Ray Eames, known as Powers of 10. So in this film, we open up with the camera hovering above a couple having a picnic in a park in Chicago. And suddenly the camera magnifies itself by the power of 10, and therefore we zoom out from the couple. And then another time, the camera expands a power of 10, and it keeps expanding to powers of 10, powers of 10, powers of 10, all the way up until 10 to the 24th power. And at this point, we're on the very outer reaches of space. We just see vast space with lights in it. And then the camera zooms back down, all the way back down to the ground, and then starts moving into the ground by powers of 10, all the way to 10 to the negative 16th power. And at this point, we're inside the very atom itself, whirling around, seeing electrons and protons and whatnot. So this film is quite fascinating. You can find it on YouTube, and I highly recommend that you watch it. It's charming for the fashions and the kind of dramatic voiceover, but it's just a visually stunning, very brief film. Now, Blake, without a magnifying glass, without a telescope, I think was able to have this sense of the world, to look at a particular thing, a grain of sand or a tree, a leaf, a tiger, to look at it with such energy, such intensity, that it's almost as if he were able to see into what he was looking at. And inside, in the interior of what he was looking at, a whole world did indeed open up. Now let's think of it this way. Emily Dickinson says, "My business is circumference." She says that in a letter to an editor of a magazine that she admired. My business is circumference. Well, what does that mean? It means that if you have an object you are attending to, let's think of that cactus that I talked about earlier, that cactus that's in my office. If you sort of figuratively move your sight around it over and over and over again, at every point in that circle you are endlessly making, you have a different view of that cactus. So in a real way, I think Dickinson is sharing Blake's view of sight, that the poet is interested in perceiving, not to pin down what he or she sees, but to open it up. So if I'm circling around this cactus, I can really see it in an infinite number of ways if I can continue circling. William James, the great psychologist of the late 19th, early 20th century, kind of had this in mind when he says that really genius is thinking of the world in an unhabitual way, sort of breaking through the habits of our mind that make the world feel predictable and safe, and seeing the world as strange and challenging, bizarrely beautiful. Percy Bysshe Shelley, in his essay Defense of Poetry, says that the poet rips away the veil of familiarity from the world and makes the world feel unfamiliar. A Russian literary critic of the early 20th century indeed said this is what all powerful literature does. It defamiliarizes the familiar. It makes what we thought we knew suddenly shimmer in strangeness, and it becomes interesting, engaging, engrossing. So, in thinking about William Blake, not only as a poet but also as a painter, we need to be very clear that his ideal way of seeing goes hard against abstraction. For William Blake, the greatest sin is abstraction, because abstract thinking turns the otherness of the world into the sameness of one's rational concepts. Blake's way of seeing pushes hard against abstraction and pushes hard toward the concrete. Because for Blake, to see a thing in its concreteness is to experience it as something strange, intricate, subtle, nuanced, beautiful, infinite. This is why Blake in The Mirrors of Heaven and Hell says, when the doors of perception are cleansed, the world will appear as it is, infinite. Now again, this infinity is not something otherworldly, cosmic, mystical, transcendent. This infinity is simply the numberless possibilities for perceiving the world if we don't try to reduce it down to the abstract concepts by which we have negotiated the world all of our lives.